reason why I'm here, aside from just Kim Hunter and the work that he does, the inspirational work that he does, Pat Ford from the University of Florida and Dr. Barham, who's on the Planck board, asked me if I would please be one of the keynote speakers. And I wanted to bring it back to Betsy Planck. Betsy Planck once said, build a can-do reputation. So I can do. So that's the reason why that I'm here today is I wanted to be able to do what Betsy has been telling each and every one of us to do, is to build that can-do reputation. But part of my presentation today is going to be focusing a little bit on D&I, and we've had a tremendous conversation about D&I. And I have to say, this conversation is always in transition, and as many of the speakers mentioned, it is part of a journey. And I've been trying to change the nomenclature around D&I for a while. So one day I was suggesting that we ought to call it diversity, inclusion, and engagement, because you can't have diversity and inclusion without engagement. The only problem with that is the acronym is DIE, DIE. So the next year I said, we cannot have diversity and inclusion without representation and equity. So then they said, Bill, we can't have that either because it's dire. But I do think that we should continue to have these conversations on the best way to be inclusive, the best way to engage, the best way, as the mayor said, to be intentional. But I'm going to hone my message into three specific areas. The first message I want to focus on is to the boomers and the Gen Xers in the room. And then later on I want to talk to the students. So a lot of people know me because of the national millennial community. It's now been expanded to the national millennial and Gen Z community. And part of the reason why that organization was set up is several major corporations around the country started sending me their reports on Gen Z. So I got a really great report from Nielsen, got a really great report from PricewaterhouseCoopers, the Pew Foundation, and there's a huge pile of reports about millennials on my desk. And one day I decided to take it home. I thought this would be great reading just before you go to bed. And I started to read the reports and I went, wow, this report is funny. Millennials aren't going to have sex. Millennials are going to kill the insurance industry. Millennials are going to ruin the banking industry. Millennials don't drive cars. Gen Zers are all connected to their mobile devices. They never put them down. And then I looked at the other report and it says, millennials are the best savers. Gen Z are going to save the country in terms of the way they look at corporate social responsibility. Another report says, no, Gen Z are not about corporate responsibility, they're all about themselves. And I put these reports aside and I said, I'm going to give them to my interns. So I brought the reports to the office and I put them in front of my interns and I said, over the next 2 days, I would like you to review these reports and tell me what they say. And in the conference room, I heard laughing, screaming, crying, shouting. 2 or 3 days later, I said, what did you learn? They said, Mr. Imada, we own up to 20% of what is written. The other 80% is wrong. Is wrong. And I said, so what are you going to do about that? And the millennials and the Gen Z folks said, Mr. Imada, there's nothing we can do. Millennials and Gen Z are defined by boomers and Gen Xers. And I said, well, you're wrong about that. You can have a voice. And they said, Mr. Imada, did you check any of these agencies? These boomers, they have a new lease on life when they turn 65. They don't go anywhere. All of a sudden they say, we have still a little bit of gas in the tank and we're not leaving our agencies or our corporations. And so what happens is the Gen Xers have nowhere to go and the millennials have nowhere to go and the Gen Z people have nowhere to go because they're stuck. And so they move around for a reason, because that's one of the reasons why they can get promoted and get new jobs, because nobody else is letting them advance. So I said, you need to speak up because you're the future of our country. And they said, Mr. Imada, we can't do that because no one will allow us that. So one of the messages to the boomers and to the Gen Xers in the room is let millennials and Gen Z at the table early. Do not hide from the millennials and Gen Z the problems of your agencies or your companies. Let them be part of the solution. And if we're going to actually have diversity and inclusion, if we're going to include people of color, women, rural white people, vets, LGBTQ, We can't just have them at the table. We've got to engage them, make them feel valued, and bring them in early to help solve not only our clients' problems, but the world's problems as well. Now to the other messages around boomers. I actually spoke at a university in San Francisco. Some of you have heard this story before, and I didn't think I would learn that much from a group of students, but I will tell you, students are my mentors. Students guide me, students help me understand the world from their perspective. And so I went to this university in San Francisco, and I walk into the room, it's a communications class, there's 25 people in the room. Almost all of them were immigrants to America. And I went, why are all of you studying communications here in America? And a student stood up and said, Mr. Imada, I'm studying communications in America for one reason. I want to understand how Americans communicate. It's really hard to understand Americans. I said, well, what's the text you're reading? He said, we're reading a text about idioms. Americans have the strangest idioms we've ever heard. So again, for the boomers and the Gen Xers, you're going to love this. And I was thinking, okay, well, let's talk about idioms. Give me an example of an idiom that confounds you. And I had a South Asian gentleman from India raise his hand. He goes, Mr. Imada, I was at an IBM conference, and there was another Indian guy there, and he said he was confused by the term, you need to think outside of the box. Now, how many of the boomers and Gen Xers in the room say, we need out-of-the-box thinking here? I say it all the time. And I said, well, what's your point? And he said, Mr. Imada, where did the box come from? Do they buy it at Walmart? How do they build it and create it? What do they do with the box when they're finished with it? And why is there a box in the conversation anyway? And I said, well, you're not really understanding. Part of the reason why we say that is because if you're in the confines of your company or you're at an agency, you have a tendency to develop this stagnant kind of culture where you perpetuate old ideas and you keep bringing them up. And so a lot of times we look for inspiration from people outside of the company, outside of our organization. And this Indian guy says to me, Mr. Imada, why do Americans believe that the best ideas are outside of their universities, outside of their agencies, outside of their companies? Why do they hire young people and not ask for their opinion? And why do they have to hire consultants like you to tell the companies and agencies what employees have been saying for the last 10 or 20 years? Ladies and gentlemen, think inside of the box first, then step out. And then I had a Japanese student raise his hand. He's raising his hand. He's like, Mr. Imada, you probably understand me because you're Japanese. And I said, well, yeah, I'm Japanese, but I was born in the States. But you're still not one of them. And I said, I'm not sure what you mean, but what's your question? And he goes, why do Americans say we should think outside of the, no, we shouldn't reinvent the wheel? Now, are there people in the room that say, let's not reinvent the wheel here? Boomers, Gen Xers, you want to fess up to this? I say, you know what, that's been done, or there's a process in place, there's a product or an advertising campaign that works, and it works well. Why replace it? Why spend the energy to change it? And that's the thinking that we have. That's why we say that. And this gentleman from Japan said, Mr. Imada, I moved to America for one reason. America's the land of innovation. I can't find that innovation in Japan. If Americans can come up with a better wheel, why wouldn't they? We invent wheels all the time and make them better. Ladies and gentlemen, and young students here, if you can reinvent the wheel, make it better, do it. And my favorite was the Taiwanese and the German guy. They sat in the back and they had 3 pages of idioms. And I said, can you just start with the first one? And he goes, Mr. Imada, why do black people have a special shopping day called Black Friday? Why do Latinos, Asians, and white people get to shop on the same day? Black people should have a 1-hour head start. And I just said, can we go on to the next topic? And the German guy says to me, Mr. Imada, why do Americans say you should walk the walk and talk the talk? Do you hear that? Yeah. And I said, well, part of it is if you have a person like me saying you should do this or you should do that, and I do something completely opposite, you're going to call me out on it. We expect people to live up to what they say, what they preach, and if we don't, then we'll criticize them. People should walk the walk and talk. And then the Taiwanese guy said, Mr. Imada, why do Americans walk and talk? Why can't they walk and just shut up? Why can't they show people what they're capable of doing. Why does it always have to be through words, and why can't it be through deeds and actions? And that's a better way to communicate with people today. And so my message to all of the boomers and the Gen Xers in the room is, don't tell people they should think outside the box. Tell them to think in the box first, step out. And learn as much as they possibly can, bring it back. But to start with the people that you have in your organizations first, especially your young new hires. If you could reinvent the wheel, do it. And don't just walk the walk. Do what this Vietnamese woman taught me after class. After the class, this Vietnamese woman runs up to me and says, Mr. Imada, you are an amazing PR person and marketer. I need help. And I said, what can I help you with? And she goes, I'm starting a restaurant in America. And I said, well, what is this restaurant going to be called? Taste of Saigon Street. Saigon is now Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. It's a dirty, grimy city. So I just said, you're going to call it what? And she goes, Taste of Saigon Street. And I said, that's gross. First of all, Saigon is a stinky, smelly city. There's all sorts of cars that pollute the air, and it's noisy. I don't think that's going to work in America. People are going to have the image of licking the street. And this woman stopped me and said, Mr. Imada, you're wrong. The noise you hear on the street is music to my ears. The smell you smell along the streets are like perfume to me. If you really want to understand the flavor of my culture and who I am, you will find it on the street. So from this point forward, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to say, taste the street. I also wanted to mention something else. One thing that Betsy Plank said that is really important, and I need to practice this more, is that we should spend more time listening. I think as PR practitioners, we're always thinking about what we're going to say, but sometimes what we need to do is spend a little bit more time listening. And one of the things that Betsy Plank said is listening is an indispensable half of the communications process, and it's a process that we often ignore. And I want you to all know, and for the students here, that you could also learn from the boomers and the Gen Xers. And I learned from people that are living and people that have passed. And I wanted to end, because I want to make sure that we get to our rounds of networking, with some of the people that have influenced my life. By the way, my mentor, aside from Kim Hunter, is a gentleman named Jesse Aguirre from Anheuser-Busch. When I started at an agency, I was the only Asian American at this 100-plus agency. The only other person that worked who was a person of color was a Latino guy in the mailroom. And I used to get asked the craziest questions, by the way, so people bear with me. But the president would come up to me occasionally and say, Bill, what do Chinese people eat? Chinese food. Brilliant! What do Cambodian people eat? Well, they probably like a little bit of Italian food occasionally because there's noodles involved. I wasn't an expert in this area at all, but I looked at these, I used to be really upset about them, but now I realize moving forward, if somebody does these things to you, and we call them microaggressions or implicit bias, look at it as a teachable moment. One thing that I'm very worried about moving forward is that we are too PC. We are way too PC in this country. I would prefer that somebody just came up to me and said, are you Japanese? Do you like Japanese food? It's a lot more, it's a little easier for me to deal with that because I don't have to worry about that person worrying about hurting my feelings. So if something like that happens to the students here, think of it as a teachable moment. Think of it as a way to help communicate and bring people into your community, into your culture. So let me end here. These are the people that influence me. And the thing I love about diversity, inclusion, engagement, representation is that you could be influenced positively by multiple people. And one person that influenced me very early on was an Italian-American woman named Catherine Barchetti. Feisty person that wanted to start a retail empire in Pittsburgh. But every time she tried to start something in Pittsburgh, she got blocked by all the establishment people in Pittsburgh. And one of the things that she said that rings true to me today is make a customer, not a sale. So to the students out there, It's not just about selling yourselves, but finding a way to let those companies and agencies know that you have something of value to bring to them and to the people they work with and represent. Then there's Booker T. Washington. He's best known for starting the Tuskegee Institute, which is now the Tuskegee University. He once said, if you want to lift up yourself, lift up someone else. And so my feeling very strongly on that is, even if it's somebody you do not like, sometimes it's not a bad idea to help lift them up, because it'll come back to you tenfold. And then Latinx people, I don't know what Latino came up with the saying, but they say, donde comen cinco, comen seis. If you could feed 5, you could feed 6. If you could feed 6 people at the table, you could add another and feed 7, 8, 9, 10. This is how we should all be looking at ideas, including the ideas that we may not agree with. There should always be room at every one of our tables for an idea, even if we disagree with it. I want to get back to Betsy Plank. Betsy Plank said we should aspire to be inspired. Ladies and gentlemen, do what you can to inspire the next generation, but also to inspire the boomers and the Gen Xers who are ahead of you. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the afternoon. To answer some questions. Was that less than 20 minutes? Anybody have a question? You guys are all, Giselle from the University of Florida.
You said about teaching people about when it comes to microaggressions, but how do you, I guess, stay with a clear mind when it comes to that? Because sometimes in the moment it can be hard to not be offended or not get angry, because I know I definitely do. So how is it a way to be more, I guess, to create a teachable mind?
Take a step back and breathe. I think somebody mentioned that last night. And I will tell you, I actually was at a diversity and inclusion conference, and it was pretty heated in the conversation, and there was an older Caucasian gentleman sitting in the back. And this is what happened. He sat, he was taking notes, he was observing, and then he finally got the courage to stand up and he said, Bill, thank you for being here. A lot of people in the agency and a lot of people at the company think I'm racist. I'm trying very, very hard to relate. And the Latinx people in the office especially think I'm racist. I just want the people in the audience to know here today that I love Latin culture. In fact, one of my favorite things to eat is tacos. A person in the front row who is from Nicaragua gets up and says, Mr. Imada, this is the reason why I don't like this man. We don't even eat tacos in my country. The man sat down, and about 5 minutes later, he cowered out of the room. And I asked the person in the front row, was there a better way to have that conversation? And she said, absolutely not. And then somebody said, I want to say something, Mr. Imada, I'm Mexican-American. We eat tacos, we have a lot of variety of tacos. My response to him would have been, I'm Nicaraguense, we don't eat tacos. But what we do eat are these foods, and I'd love to invite you to lunch with me so you can learn a little bit about my culture. And to me, I think that that's a better way to bring people in than to embarrass them in front of 300 people. And so my message here is sometimes step back for a moment and say, was the intention wrong? And is there something that I might be able to teach this person and teach everyone else in the process? And I know that it's not easy. The mayor said we have to be intentional. The mayor says we have to stand up and speak for ourselves and set our agendas. But sometimes there's opportunities when people try, meet them halfway there. And I think that that's something that we should do as diversity and inclusion executives and leaders, is to find those teachable moments. And sometimes it's important to step back. I have it happen to me all the time, by the way, and it used to piss me off. I mean, I went to an event the other day and go, Bill, we're going to go out for sushi. We don't need to go out for sushi. They go, no, the sushi is really great. And I said, where's the closest ocean? They said 5.5 hours away. I said, we don't need to have sushi. But and then while we were there, the executive that was with me said, Bill, the sushi chef is Japanese. Say something in Japanese. And I said, I was born in the Far East, the far eastern part of Oregon. But sure, konnichiwa. And the sushi guy said, I'm Korean. But rather than embarrass the person I was with, I was just saying, a lot of the Koreans run sushi places, a lot of the Latinos run sushi places, a lot of white people run sushi places. So, don't worry about it. But I want you to know that, we have two different languages, and I think I insulted him, and so we had a conversation about it, and we looked at it as a teachable moment. Yes.
I'm just curious, you had mentioned too about how to make sure we don't shut down people. I'd love to get your views on that, because a lot of times, a lot of agencies, corporations, I deal with a lot of students who are in their first or second year of their jobs, and they come back and tell me, oh man, I tried to make an appointment at a meeting and just got shut down. So I appreciate even the project you gave your interns, and they tell me what's wrong with this thing and value their input. So I'd love to get you some more insight as to how we can inform and empower our students to kind of stand up with courage, but also empower our other more senior folks to allow those opinions at the table.
Well, hopefully we don't have to have an American Airlines situation. But I think one of the things that the students can do well is to find champions that also lend their voices within the agency or within a corporation. So finding those champions, it takes something really simple, which I was afraid to do when I was growing up. My mentor, Jesse, this is kind of a circuitous way of getting to this, but my mentor was Jesse Aguirre from Anheuser-Busch. And one day, I went to Jesse Aguirre and I said, can I have 20 minutes of your time? And he said, I'm busy. I'm the executive VP of the company, but sure, what do you want to? And I said, I want to pick your brain about getting more business for my company. He goes, yeah, absolutely. Fly out to St. Louis. So I flew out to St. Louis. I got there early, and I saw him milling around his office at 8 o'clock sharp. His assistant calls me and says, Bill, come on in the office. Mr. Aguirre is ready to talk to you. So we're having this great conversation about mentoring, about talking to different companies. 8:20, he looks at his watch, and guess what he says? Get out. And I said, Mr. Aguirre, why did you just say that? He goes, get out of my office right now. And I said, we're having a great conversation. We're talking about these different companies. You're sharing some. He said, Mr. Imada, you asked for 20 minutes of my time. It's now 8:21. Get out. And as I was walking out, he said, stop. I want to teach you a lesson. Ask for what you want. And I said, but that's not in my DNA. I don't care. He said, as a person of color, figure it out, because black people and Latin people before you figured it out. And I'm not going to be here to teach you a lesson. You're going to have to learn it from all the people that struggled before you, so now get out. So the message here is sometimes you have to ask for what you want, and that's not easy to do. But I also want students to be smart. I mean, many of you have taken accounting. I hated accounting. But one of the things that I learned in that was LIFO and FIFO. Do you know what LIFO is? Last in, first out. That's me, because I'm an introvert. So, maybe the professor says, Bill, you got to show up at this event and you got to network. I get that. But if the event started at 5, I would show up at 5:30. And then I would make sure that all the people I needed to see saw me, and then I would be the first one out. But now I'm trying to get young people to be the opposite and do FI-LO, first in, last out. And one of the things that young people can do is get there early, talk to the people that they need to talk to, and say what you're planning to say and what you want to do and why you want to be a part of this conversation. And that conversation starts before the meeting and then is followed up after the meeting. So you want to make a good first impression, and then you want to follow it up with a great last impression. And I don't think young people do that. And I think that executives will be really impressed if somebody took the time to do the research first and say, this is what I want to say, this is how I want to do it. Give me the floor to do that. Give me the opportunity to do that. And if you ask an executive for that, executives are probably going to let you do it because a lot of times they want people to challenge them. I don't know if I answered that question. Oh, we have more time? Yes?
Hi. So my question / comment has to do largely on the education side. Just because I was reading Hydrogen's Practice of Adaptive Leadership and learning how to go about diagnosing the system and then diagnosing how you want to adapt in order to take care of the problem that you're seeing. So I'm relating it to these situations where you're turning these microaggressions or these uncomfortable encounters into teachable moments. I was curious because I know, particularly at my school, there's a lot of people who come from a very distinct background, they're very protective of their culture, of their background, and it becomes difficult to assimilate to these environments, bringing their full self without creating conflict when there's other people who haven't necessarily encountered people like that. So I'm curious as to what exactly informed this point of view that you're able to hold, if there's any literature, any kinds of books that maybe I could take back to my school to be able to give them more substance to this concept of staying on the balcony and looking at it from an above ground point of view rather than personalizing the issue and using the opportunity to teach someone.
I'm going to try to answer this with a quick story. I'm from a very small town in Eastern Oregon, but I grew up in the city of LA. And we were on a trip. And on this trip with the National Millennial and Gen Z community, we invited students from red states, blue states, and purple states. And a large number of the students were from rural communities, and they were rural white communities. And on the bus, we went to Verizon, and during the meeting at Verizon, the executive at Verizon said, "Bill, don't be mad at me." Kim knows this person, Tarad. But how many of you voted for Bernie Sanders? I was like, oh, where's this going? So all these hands, 18 out of 27 hands go up. And he goes, well, now that Bernie's out of the race, how many of you are going to vote for Hillary? 3 hands out of 18 go up. And we have a conversation about why that happened. And he goes, well, I probably don't need to talk about Donald Trump. 4 hands go up. And this woman from Colorado shot the dirtiest look to the woman from Eastern Oregon, which is where I'm from, who was from a rural white community. Like, if looks could kill, that would be it. And then on the bus, and I'm going to probably exaggerate just a tad, they had a colossal fight. The woman from Colorado was a Muslim. And she said, how dare you vote for a person like Donald Trump? He's a womanizer. He is sexist. He's racist. How dare you do that? And the woman from Eastern Oregon said this: you're not the only one that feels disenfranchised in this country. You're not the only one that feels like everyone thinks you're entitled. Well, I want you to know something. My mom and dad work 18 hours a day, 7 days a week to put food on your table. Oh, and by the way, you go to the University of Colorado. You have a lot of electives. Your electives are French, German, Spanish, Japanese, and Chinese. You could take literature. You could take a work-study course off campus. Oh, guess what my electives are in Eastern Oregon? How to fix a combine, how to fix a used car, and 1 semester of Spanish. Oh, people are saying that your parents need to retrain for another job. Well, guess what? The job training place is 150 miles away, and my mom and dad do not know how to turn on a computer. They've never had a computer. So who is disenfranchised? And the Muslim woman from Colorado said, I have never heard that story before. Tell me more. And then after that conversation, the woman from Eastern Oregon said, I've never met a Muslim woman before. Tell me what your life is like. And she told her. They're best friends today. So the situation that we have in this country today, which really bugs me and doesn't allow us to have a teachable moment, is that we are defriending people that we don't like because they voted for a Republican or they voted for a Democrat or they love guns and they eat guns. To me, that's a travesty. If we're really going to preach diversity and inclusion, we've got to welcome every viewpoint to the table, regardless of whether or not we love it or not, unless that person is preaching hate and murder. But I think we should always leave that room. And so I don't think I need a book, because people like you are teaching me every day. I would never have that conversation, and I wouldn't have heard that on the bus unless I was traveling that day. And the professor that was with me grabbed my arm and said, Bill, stop that conversation. You got to stop it. And I said, no, let that conversation go on. And you know why? They got tired after 20 minutes. And after 20 minutes, they stopped and took a breath and said, wow, I didn't know that about you. And they learned, and by the way, this Muslim woman actually flew all the way to Boise and drove 3 hours to attend this rural Caucasian woman's graduation. And they made a video together, how to bring the country together. And so if we're going to be good diversity stewards, we don't have to read a book. We could just talk to each other, listen as Betsy said we should be doing, and look at that other half as a way to teach other people about who we are and what we're all about. By the way, I don't read PR books. I like reading novels. And because I think you'll learn more from a novel than you'll learn from a PR book. Sorry. Anything else? Are we good? Oh, back there.
So just like continuing on the topic of like microaggressions and stuff and like having a teachable moment, there's been like a lot of conversation lately saying like, why should it be like the community's responsibility to educate these ignorant people, especially if they don't want to be like educated or learn more about that? So how would you consider like handling those kinds of situations?
First of all, Lakeisha is right. There's always going to be a few people that you'll never win their hearts and minds. But you know what? I won't give up. And one thing that I will always remember, there was a Native American who ran for Congress. He represented the state of Colorado. His name was Ben Knight Horse Campbell. And he said, there's but one factor for success: never give up. I will tell you that we all have stories. Once we stop telling those stories, we're going to miss an opportunity to teach. And sometimes you have to tell that story more than once. And for me, that's okay. Because somebody's going to hear that story, and somebody's going to remember that story. So, yeah, there's going to be a few people that you won't be able to convince, and that isn't always your responsibility, but at least you should try. And I won't stop trying. Because I think that we give up way too easily in this country. And that's the problem, I think, what I'm seeing with people that are applying for jobs. You apply once, you say, oh, Bill, nobody ever got back to me. Well, apply again, or keep trying, or find a different way to get there. Because I think our mentality in this country is unfortunately one direction. It's go from point A to point B with a straight line. Well, guess what? People don't make decisions anymore with a straight line. They'll go this way, this way, this way, and that way. It doesn't really matter how you get to point B as long as you get there. If it takes you 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, that's okay. So for me, it's like if there's an opportunity for a teachable moment, I'm going to take it. And even if it takes me 10 years to do it, if I can help someone understand and I can learn from them, then I'm going to take that chance. So it might be different for you, but that's just me. Oops, one more, and then I think we should probably wrap up, right? One more.
Hi, hello, my name is Grace Gregoire. I currently go to the University of Florida as a fourth-year student. Go Gators. So currently, I'm the founder and president of the nation's second Black Population Student Society. And in a way, I feel like I'm somewhat leading a affinity group at the university level. So what would you say to a student who's a leader within their college, within a group as something similar to my group, and wanting to make that transition into the career field? So what would you say to a student who's trying to serve a purpose and encourage students to serve a purpose on their campuses and in the corporate world?
First of all, I think it's great that you're starting a Beepers chapter on the University of Florida, because I do think that each of the communities have their own needs and their own interests and aspirations. But one way to get into the corporate world is to find that intersection. And a few people talked about intersectionality. There are intersections with all of the employee and business resource groups at all of the major corporations and at almost all of the major holding companies for PR agencies. So find those connections, but also reach out and make connections with some of the other ERG groups, like the LGBT ERG group or the Veterans ERG group, or the Asian and Pacific Islander veterans affinity groups. Reach out to those, because you can learn from every single person that you pull in. And I would even encourage you to bring in the people that don't agree with you, because we should always look for a way to have those dialogues, and not necessarily to try to convince, but try to understand where people are coming from. So you're in a good position as a African American affinity group that's at the University of Florida, and there are plenty of affinity groups all through Florida and through the region. Reach out to them and say, I need help. I'd like to learn a little bit more about who you are, and I'd like to pull you into our community, but we'd also like to be pulled into yours. And don't give up. By the way, when people say no, no means maybe. All right, thank you so much for your time.